Well, now, for 3 weeks, or this is the third week that we have been in the Gospel of John, and we haven't started the Gospel of John yet. So it is time to start the Gospel of John. Spent the first 2 sessions on some introductory matters, and tonight we're actually going to get into the first 5 verses anyway. John Norris questioned whether or not I would even get through verse 1, so I'm sure he's quite shocked tonight that I have through verse 5 on here. We'll see how far we get and discuss some of these things that, especially in the first chapter and these first few verses, in fact, really all the way up through about, chapter 15 or so, there's a lot of philosophical talk that goes on as John's gospel begins its work. And I think that we would presume anyway, though John's gospel does not state this, we would presume that the purpose of the gospel is to convince the reader that Jesus is the Son of God. We have other gospels, as we talked last week. It really takes all 4 of them to get the entire picture, and those other gospels convince us of other things about Jesus, but here it is to convince us that Jesus is the Son of God, which is really what John says at the end, as we'll get there. But we even begin to pick that up from the very beginning, and I want us to walk through these first 5 verses tonight and see if we can come to understand a little bit of where the writer is coming from, as he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." I suppose that among church-going people, these are some of the most familiar words that there are in the Bible. Certainly wouldn't be, in the top 2 or 3, but it's probably in the top 10 anyway, that if we were to begin in a Sunday school class and say, "In the beginning was the Word," that class collectively at least would be able to finish the verse. There's enough knowledge of this word. So in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Let me just say here that I don't have this on the outline, so I want to stick it in right here before I forget. And that is that this verse right here is the verse in which there is the most difference between, say, for example, Orthodox Christianity and the Jehovah's Witness. The Jehovah's Witness actually has their own translation of the Bible, chiefly due to this verse. If you know anything about other Christian-based cults, I guess you would say, spin-offs of Christianity, many of them are comfortable using the Bible. It has to do with their interpretation of the words that cause them to go where they are. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, they use the King James Bible along with the Pearl of Great Price and Doctrine and Covenants. But Jehovah's Witness have their own translation of the Bible. The biggest difference in the Jehovah's Witness Bible is this verse right here. At the end of it, the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was, theirs will say, a God. The Word was a God. Little g with the A in it. Now, with that, just as a little bit of background, we could study Jehovah's Witness theology another day. But with that, we come to "in the beginning." This particular phrase in Greek is only used 4 times. Of course, we could look back into some Hebrew, and we know at least one very famous time it was used in Hebrew. But this Greek phrase was used 4 times. 2 of them are right here. In verse 1, "in the beginning," and in verse 2, the same was "in the beginning." So we only have 2 others to compare to see what we are talking about. And what we can figure out is, even if we didn't even have those other 2, is it is a phrase, 2 words that demand something else. In the beginning of what? In the beginning of the service, in the beginning of time, in the beginning of my speech to you. It has to have something. The only way you know what it is in the beginning of, there are 2 ways you know. One is maybe the sentence is completed instead of an assumed completion like we got here. Here, obviously, our sentence is not completed. There are those other 2 times And in Acts 11:15, we don't have to turn there, but in Acts 11:15, also it is assumed by context. It is not completed. In that case, it is in the beginning of the ministry. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 15, it is stated, in the beginning of the gospel. So that's the only time, 1 out of 4 times, it is actually completed. These other 2 times, we have to do a little bit of fill in the blank, a little bit of assumption by the context, and not only the context, but by by context, I mean this immediate context. Let's look into John chapter 1 or into all of the Gospel of John and try to figure out the context. But then we could go to what is broader context, I guess you could argue. But really, that is just allowing the Scripture itself to speak to it. And so if we search the Scripture for other phrases in the beginning, of course, there's obviously that very famous one, which says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Exactly. Now, I think that the average mind, at least, would say, okay, in the beginning was the Word. And then the average mind is going to say, in the beginning of what? And then they're going to say, oh yeah, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So our assumption, just in average kind of normal kind of reading, our assumption is going to be, we're talking about in the beginning, of all things, in the beginning of all things. And verses 2 and 3 lead. And verses, you're one step ahead of me. So we're going to assume it's in the beginning of all things, and then we're going to read along and confirm that to be true. And as we get into verses 2 and 3, I think it settles the matter that we really are talking about in the beginning of all things. And so we're forced to make this assumption that even before God created time and space, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. So in the beginning, God. It aligns with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 so well that I think you would really have to work hard to argue that that's not what we're talking about here. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Let's talk about Word here. This is obviously philosophical language, poetic language, perhaps you could say, that in the beginning was the Word. It's not that in the beginning was the alphabet, and the alphabet in the soup, alphabet soup came and spelled a word there. And that was the very first word. We were talking at dinner about Isley and what her first word would be, and we're hoping it's "Hey, Randy." And another girl whose first word was gorilla. But that's obviously not at all what we're talking about here in the Word. So you've got this Greek word, logos, which is clearly more than a combination of letters W-O-R-D or L-O-G-O-S. It's far more than that. It is... this is the term that is for the meaning and the sound, if you will. That's when you would use logos, is the meaning and the sound. Therefore, logos is the spoken word more than the written word. The written word in Greek is the graphe, and the spoken word is the logos, or the heard word, if you can. The kind of word that moves sound waves, that is the logos. And so here we've got that. Now, I think that even in English, we, of course, bring that word logos in a number of different ways, but one of the ways we do it, I suppose most clearly even, is in a logo. What is a logo? A logo is usually some sort of graphic presentation that communicates. And what does it communicate? A logo, the best of logos anyway, is supposed to communicate the essence of who that company is. When you see that, you think of, the essence of the company there. And so that would be a good logo. For example, Nike, I don't know if I want to bring them up or not, but they've got the little swoosh, right? And that brings us back to the ancient Greeks and the victory and the athleticism and all of that. That's kind of the essence of who the company was before their latest spokesman. So it brings all of that about. That's the logo or the logos. So could you say, and I think you could you say, in the beginning was meaning? There was meaningful, there was meaning, there was essence there. That essence, if you will, didn't start with Adam and Eve or light and darkness, whatever it is. That existed before then. So in the beginning was the Word, or was the Logos, and that word Logos being the spoken word, I think does also tie us back to Genesis 1:1, because in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and the very next verse says, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. And all of those verses then go with the spoken word. And it is the spoken word which brings about the created order. And we get into verses 2 and 3, we're going to see that's exactly what this is about. That you had that the logos, the meaning, the essence, the spoken word, the existence that was prior to our beginning. And it was ultimately in the beginning. So in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There is a guy that was also from Ephesus. Tradition is that John, if John wrote it, was from Ephesus. And there is a guy named Heraclitus. Did I pronounce that right, David?
Heraclitus,
I think you're right when I said Heraclitus is how you pronounce it. Heraclitus, David's our resident philosopher. So Heraclitus lived in the 6th century BC, and here's one. There's the entire works of Heraclitus are not preserved, but there are various fragments that are preserved. And he is kind of the father of Western philosophy, they say. Not a whole lot out there on him, but nonetheless, here's one of the little fragments that we have of Heraclitus. He says this: although this logos, obviously we've translated into English here except for that Greek word logos, although this logos is eternally valid. Notice that. In the beginning was the Word, and Heraclitus says this logos is eternally valid, yet men are unable to understand it. Later on, we're going to get, even before we're out tonight, that there was this lack of comprehension, if you will.
Heraclitus. Nobody really knows, but Heraclitus is how I
Heraclitus. Sounds like we need to see a doctor. Got a bad case of. Yes. Well, your professor's probably right then. There's this lack of comprehension, if you will, goes on, not only before hearing it, but even after they heard it for the first time. Though all things come to pass in accordance with this logos. Now, all things come to pass. When we get down to verse 3, what's it going to say? All things were made by him, is what John says. So, again, a lot of similarities here. All things come to pass in accordance with this logos. Men seem to be quite without any experience of it. Remember, one of the also famous verses in chapter 1 is, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. So again, it echoes, men seem to be quite without any experience of it. Now, what does that mean, all of these similarities? Does it mean that the author of John's gospel copied from Western philosophy? Maybe. That doesn't bother me, by the way. That let's assume, and we've decided not to assume this for the study as a whole. But let's assume that John wrote it, and John's from Ephesus, and in Ephesus there's this famous philosopher, and his words maybe are carved on the library that David and Shelley and I got to see there. And there's some, we didn't actually see his words carved, by the way, but we're supposing that there is a room there, and it's carved or it's hanging on a plaque there or whatever it is. And so this is familiar kind of writing. It would not be unusual then to say, I want to kind of piggyback on that in order to go further with it. This is the same thing Paul did at Mars Hill, you remember, when he said, here we have this statue to the unknown God. Let me tell you the identity of the unknown God. So he takes it and moves forward with it. So I don't think that's necessarily copying, because they're certainly not the same words, but a lot of similarities, a lot of the same ideas there. But even if John copied it, does that mean the idea, even if the author copied it, I have a hard time with that, does that mean that the idea began with Heraclitus? Heraclides. Miss Dr. Professor H. Does it mean that that guy started it? No, that's just fragments we have that are similar. And so I think that if we were to read the other fragments that we have of this philosopher, we would find that he doesn't always come to the same conclusion. They certainly don't always have the same ideas. And yet we would also see in some ways they very much do have the same ideas. But if it is true that in the beginning was the Logos, then it's true in 600 BC, just like it is in the first century AD, isn't it? And so it is not necessarily a new idea to say essence came before we did. There has been meaning to life. There has been the source of life. There's been the ultimate cause of life far before we are. Even the philosophers agree with that. And so he comes along here. These similarities, you notice that both of them do use the term logos. Both of them speak as logos as eternal. Both of them speak of the incomprehension of the logos. Both of them speak of the logos as the source of all things. Both of them speak of a rejection of the logos. And both men were, by tradition, living in Ephesus when they wrote. Now, this writing here actually goes further in almost seeming to answer the philosopher and come along and say, okay, in the beginning was the Logos, no doubt about it. The Logos was God. And he gives some handle to it a little bit, if God has handles. But nonetheless, he begins to put some identity. The Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And he's going to go down, we won't get to it tonight, but he's going to go down and talk about how the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. And that obviously is going to lead to the bigger argument where he's saying Jesus Christ is the Logos and he has dwelt among us. And that his hope is that his readers in the end will agree with him. Now he hasn't proven anything. He's just sort of setting his point out at the beginning, and he's going to go to prove it as time goes on. And so here he comes. In the beginning, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. That is to say that the Word predates the beginning. In the beginning, there already was God. And in fact, verse 3 is going to confirm that all things were made by him. So there's nothing that is made that was not made by him. So that is the introduction. Verse 2, along those same lines, the same was in the beginning with God. I often wonder why sometimes there's repetition. And in one sense, verse 2 is not essentially necessary, is it? Because verse 1 says, in the middle of verse 1, the Word was with God. And verse 2 says, the same was in the beginning with God. That, again, it's a repetition, if you will. I think that it has to do with the balance of words that the ancient mind had, that there had to be not only a fullness of truth, but really even in the way it was presented, there had to be this alliteration, so to speak, that went on. And I think if we were to understand Greek poetry, if you will, we would see this a little bit better, that it just is not only pleasing to the mind or feeds the mind, but it is pleasing to the eye when you see it out there and all the things. That, if I might get on a soapbox for a moment, I should put one right here because I get on it quite often, right? I think that our world today, our modern Western culture today, has lost the value of presentation. In so many different ways, we've lost that value. And chiefly where it matters, I think, is in the presentation of words. Even, you go back to, I don't know, the Declaration of Independence or something like that, and some of those lines that we can remember, and we can see how they were written and picture it all in our mind, and we've lost that ability to do so. I don't know exactly what all the factors were that caused us to lose that ability, but we certainly have lost that ability. I would say that in so many areas, even, for example, churches and church buildings. Presentation used to be a major part of coming together and trying to figure out what you're going to do, and now it's kind of utilitarian is what we've got. Again, that's just a little soapbox here. I think that I don't fully understand it, and not fully understanding it, I cannot fully even appreciate nor comprehend it. But I think this is what John, the author here has, is this is more pleasing to the eye, to the ear, to the mind, as it is given here. So in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the same was in the beginning with God.
I used to just trying to confuse people a little bit more by adding, well, first of all, what he's most known for, Heraclitus, is the saying, you cannot step into the same river twice.
Yes.
His emphasis being there is everything is in motion, everything is in the realm of becoming, everything's moving. So there's nothing really we can grab onto except the logos, which is eternal. That's one of his ideas. But there was another guy who was living at the same time as Heraclitus, Parmenides. And he was saying something which they held to be contrary to what Heraclitus was saying. He was saying that there's an identity between being and thinking. Think about Americans. We're mostly, what we believe in is most real is what we can stub our toe on. We're materialists, essentially, what we can see and touch and feel. This is really taking us to another place, beginning, just in those few words, we've overcome the body-mind dualism. We've got the mind, the word, and the body, the flesh, and they were one. They're and when we have this in the beginning was the Word, and the Word, what was the second thing? The same was in the beginning. See, I don't think it's even temporal there. I think the beginning is arche, right?
Yes, arche.
It's sort of like the principle. And in that, not in the beginning, in the beginning of time, but in the sense that the arche is a creative principle. It creates. And in it was the logos, was this intelligence that manifests in creation. And so we have, I love these words. I mean, it's like, all of a sudden we've stepped away from history for a moment, and we're really talking about
the meaning of history, if you will. Yeah.
The most mysterious of things, the relationship between this world, the visible world, the fleshly world, and the world of thought, the world of spirit, the world of ideas. There's a whole philosophical school, German idealism, which uses this biblical scripture as essentially the beginning of its philosophy. I mean, this is like exploring this took them thousands of pages, but confused everybody enough.
No, I appreciate those comments, and it does, I think, just show the depth of writing, of meaning, of education that this author had. That this is not. I don't want to downplay Mark and Mark's gospel, but Mark's gospel is a very utilitarian gospel. Jesus went and did this, and then he went and did that, and then he carried out. And we need to know that. That's having the full picture of that. But here, it really does step in to a worldview issue that was hotly debated both in the Jewish world and in the Greek world, even in those days, as philosophy was par excellence. That's what you gathered around and discussed with your pita bread and carried out. So here are these beautiful words, and then given in poetic ways to show that the Word was God, the Word was with God, which really is a Trinitarian concept that is hinted at here. Now, let's get into verse 3, which also gets into this worldview issue very much. It says, all things were made by Him. I'm going to stop right there and back up. The him reminded me. Verse 2, the same was in the beginning. In the Greek, what you have there on the same is actually a second person masculine pronoun, which we might often put as he. The King James, for whatever reason, I'm not exactly sure, decided to go with the same as in referring to God, or the Word, the Logos, but very clear in the Greek, and some of the translations will carry that over, that in the Greek, we've got this masculine singular that is used here. He's going to point all of this to Jesus. Now, I don't think it's essential that in fact, let me back up here to those King James translators. I think what they struggled with is, do we want to emphasize that we're talking about the Logos, and so let's say the same, or do we want to use the word he and kind of leave it open to interpretation on who the he is? So I think that's why they said, if I can recreate their thinking, and I'm probably totally off, but when you get to verse 3, they probably said, we've got a him there, so that's going to clarify it by the time we get into verse 3, so let's go with him. But you could take verse 2 and say, and the Word was God, and He, the Word, was in the beginning with God, and all things, verse 3, were made by Him. All things were made by Him. And without Him was not anything made that was made. Now, one of the things that John does here is take this philosophy of Logos and identifies it in the masculine singular personage, if you will, who, of course, is going to end up being Jesus Christ as the him he's introducing here. He hadn't got there yet, and it's kind of like, maybe you go to a banquet and there's a surprise speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker tonight is from Kalamazoo, and he is so famous that everyone here knows about him, and he's a magician, and he has a black hat, and all these kind of things that are done. And now let me introduce you to, and the name. So that's where he's going to get, but he's very clearly showing us here that there's an identity. There really is, again, I don't know if it's the best words, but there really are some handles to this Logos picture that he's got out there. And so all things were made by him. The Greek there, just if you're interested, the Greek just says all, and things is kind of assumed. The word is panta, all. All were made by him. All things were made by him. And without him was not anything made that was made. So we've got a clarity here that the Word made all things. Now, in worldview issues, one of the fundamental issues to worldview is, what is, worldview teachers or students typically would call it the first cause. What is the first cause? Or, if I might cheapen that a little bit, what is the first thing? The first thing is really the thing from which all other things emanate from. So what is that first thing, or that first cause that is out there? And how a person, Where a person lands on that issue determines really their worldview. We could give a dozen more than the three I've given here, but a deist is someone who believes that there was a deity that was in the beginning. And there's all forms of deism, obviously, and yet there is a higher power, a being out there that was in the beginning. That would be their worldview. Now, a materialist, and obviously John is not going to be one, but a materialist believed that matter existed first, and all the things, and let's start with things, all the things that are here today emanated from or morphed out of or grew from or were propagated by, however it happened, from that original matter. That's a material worldview. Not only all things, but all ideas. You started out with matter, and that created some ooh, which created goo, which created you, right? And you then had a thought, and you thought fire, and then you thought wheel. And these ideas came from matter, originally matter. Now, that's a very common worldview in Western civilization. Modern Western civilization, anyway, has that very common worldview. I think that's probably fairly recent in Western thinking, but nonetheless is perhaps the most common today. A socialist believes this one's a little bit different because they would say, well, the first cause is society. Society caused, and therefore society, whatever that first cause or first thing is, that's what you've got to rotate around, if you will. Your life has to be centered around that first thing. Well, John comes out here and he shows himself to be a deist, doesn't he? We don't know how his deism, I keep saying John, that's a hard one to break. The author of the Gospel of John comes out and says that he's a deist. In the beginning was God, the Word. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Logos, the essence, the being, everything that you and I see, think, hear, and do emanated from Him. That's the starting point that we have to go. And so that's the place where if you're going to center your life, and everybody should kind of center their life, right? That's what you need to center it around. This is going to be his argument, which again, though he says it philosophically or poetically here, he's going to come to the end and said, these things I have written in order that you might know the Son of God and knowing that you might believe in His name. He says that very practically for his closing arguments, if you will, but he starts it very philosophically right here. And so I think we can already tell that the goal of the fourth gospel is to convince the reader that there is a God that was in the beginning, and Jesus is the incarnation of God and is God. And that's what he's going to begin to lay out his argument here. And this gospel lays out that premise from the beginning. Now, let's suppose you never had read Matthew, Mark, Luke. Maybe even you haven't read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, that you just, all of a sudden you're just there. If that's all you had, right now, you would be saying, he's got some philosophy, and he's pretty quickly landing the plane of his philosophy. He's not going to circle it around and talk about all of these philosophies, but he goes from philosophy and just so quickly lands that plane and says, here is where I am philosophically, and I want to then prove my point to that. Again, I think that's what we would suspect at this point. And in him, verse 4, was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. In him, there we have that masculine singular pronoun again. So it's trying to bring down the, could I say the kind of fuzzy term logos? I don't know if it's proper to call it a fuzzy term, but into this personage that was in the beginning, was with God, was God, and we're going to have later on a name given to him. In the Logos was life. He is the source of life. We saw that in verse 3. Now it's clarified here that all things came from him. And he further clarifies or describes life here. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And I suppose what he's saying there is that real life or meaning in life, light in life, understanding in life requires him, is what the author's saying. You can't get there without him. You're going to have, to borrow from the poetic way in which he's speaking, you're going to be walking in the dark without him. You need him in the answers that he is going to provide. He is the life. He is the light of men. But going on with that, the light shineth in darkness. It's very good, isn't it? But what happened? The darkness comprehended it not. Well, we've got some work to do on that little phrase. The light shineth in darkness, but the darkness comprehended it not. How does darkness not comprehend light? What in the world are we talking about? Let's talk about the word comprehended first of all. The Greek word is katalambano. And lambano, the root of the word lambano is to receive. But the problem is, in the context, it could be to take. And you can understand in the English mind even how that's kind of the same thing. You hand me something and I took it. So receive, to take, it's kind of the different sides of the same coin, which makes this a little bit difficult, and it explains why we're going to have two translations that ultimately say, I think, two different things. And we're going to have to decide which we go with, which is the correct understanding. Now, we often say things like, it doesn't really matter which translation you use, they all say the same thing. And we're comfortable, I think, with saying the same thing in a different way. I don't think we require that there be, the words that Brian Ross used were verbatim identicality. You can communicate the exact same thing without verbatim identicality. So we're comfortable with that. But we also know that sometimes different words say actually different things. Maybe even they say the opposite thing. And in the translations that we've got here, I think what we've got with lambano, and it all hinges on which side of the coin are you going to take, to receive or to take, is going to affect the way we come to understand this. Now, let's take that lambano again, to receive or to take. And you remember, because you're great Greek students, that kata, the prefix, emphasizes it to the ultimate degree. So what is it to receive something ultimately? What's the ultimate receiving of something? Well, again, that becomes a little bit challenging. I don't know. I mean, you receive it, you really received it. I think it would be if you were to give me a gift that maybe came from your grandfather's farm. And I don't know much about farming, and I, being the strapping young lad that I am, don't know anything about generations ago and how they used all those things. And so you give me something, and I take it, and I really don't have a clue what it is. I have received it, but have I katalambano? Have I ultimately received it? Well, not necessarily, because I don't understand what it is. Yeah, I got it, but I don't understand what it is. I don't understand that it is such a meaningful part of your life because it was your grandfather's and you used to sit at your grandfather's knee and all the things that are, I don't know any of that. And so to me, it's just like, yeah, thanks. And I have received it, lambano, but I don't think I have katalambano. And if I katalambano, then I look at that and I say, this is something of rich meaning. It is something of rich history. It is something that cannot be replaced. It is something that has your grandfather's fingerprints. It is something that is a treasure to you. And it is something that represents history. All these kind of things. If I really get it, then I'm going to go with kata lambano. Now, that's the best I know how to describe lambano versus kata lambano. I do know that the author here used kata lambano, not lambano. So the light came, and the darkness did not receive it. I think that scenario I just described is why the King James authors, first of all, didn't say receive, lambano, but they said comprehend. Comprehend is I really get it. I fully understand it. And therefore, they chose that word, comprehend, which is not really just an intellectual kind of comprehend word. There were other Greek words that meant that. So we don't expect them to come forward with comprehend here. We expect them to come forward with, receive or take or whatever. And they didn't. And I think it's that kata thing that came in. There was the reason that they didn't do that. Yeah, good point. In our studio with Ask the Theologian on Thursday nights, the scroll that's back there that's framed, and it's got a story to me, and it's furthermore, I'll tell you, and I've probably mentioned this before, when I have guests who are Jewish, especially if they're from Israel and they read Hebrew fluently, when they come in and see it, nothing else is in the room. Wow, where did you get this is always the first question. Where did you get this? Because they fully comprehend the meaning, the value, all those kind of things that are behind it. Whereas you and I look at it and say, it's a picture of a bunch of words that I can't read. And therefore doesn't have that meaning. So kata lambano, I think, is the word here that is used. Now, with that, the ESV comes along, and I'm sure some of the others too. I only looked at King James and ESV. And they say the darkness has not overcome it. So, the light came, and the darkness did not overcome it. Now, think about, first of all, I talked about these really mean two different things. The darkness did not comprehend it means that the darkness, continues, right? It kind of rejected the light. There was no comprehension. There was no ultimate receiving of it. And the darkness has not overcome it, says the light won. The darkness did not overcome the light. The light was more powerful than the darkness. So one says the darkness is still there. The other says the darkness is gone. That's not saying the same thing, right? So clearly we have a difference here. And I think, by the way, that though we're not going to do it tonight because it's almost 7 o'clock, and furthermore, it's not totally germane to the study here, I do think that the church or Christians need to come and study this translation thing more closely and really figure out what is the Bible, because if one says the darkness is still here and one says the darkness is not still here, that you can't call them both the Bible, right? And I hate to cause the discomfort there that brings, because for some of us, I don't even know if I have a Bible. But I think what it says is we really ought to pursue these things and deal with them and be like I think the great Greek philosophers were, and keep asking questions, keep digging, keep looking for it. So how did the ESV get there? The truth is that the words can mean what the ESV says. The truth is it was not necessarily a mistranslation on their part. So King James, as I said, took it as comprehend, as I've already explained to you. But that is in receive. I talked about, kata lambano, fully receiving. But what if it's kata lambano, not receive, but it's the flip side of that coin, and that is to take. So rather than receive, it is, I took it into my hands. The darkness did not take it into its hands. The darkness did not grab hold of it. The darkness did not, kata, let's say, overtake it, as the ESV did. Again, you can see it's a flip side. Did they receive? Did they take? Which is it? And I don't think the grammar fully answers the question. Unfortunately, grammar doesn't always answer the question. Sometimes it does. Here it doesn't answer the question. So you've only got the context to go by. I think that the context that you have here, the darkness comprehended it not, is better, because he's going to go on to say, light came, but darkness continues. Later on, again, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. The light shone, but the darkness did not comprehend it. It did not ultimately receive it. That is, the light came, and there was still darkness. And I think we can understand this about light, obviously, that if you're in a vast area of darkness, the darkness sometimes might win, right? And how in the world are we going to light all of that up? And what John is going to get to here, and I think only further context is going to explain this, is that there is still darkness, that the light has not yet completely eradicated darkness. And he wants that to be kind of part of the tension that is given here philosophically underneath all of this. So it is a little bit of a, the forces of light and the forces of darkness, or the force and the force, may the force be with you. And there's this underlying thing going on in our world with pre-existence, and yet still the darkness or the incomprehension or whatever it is all through there. And so with that, then, we are going to pick up on this philosophical journey and get into verse 6. Now, let me tell you just a little bit of the way at least really all of chapter 1 goes. It goes like this. I talked about the balance that he had in his words. And you see it in the formatting of John chapter 1. He talks about the Word, and then he talks about a man named John the Baptist. And then he'll go back and talk about the Word, or the Logos. And then he'll go back and he'll talk about the man named John. And he's got this balance going between the Word and John proclaimed the Word, and the Word and John proclaimed the Word. And this is the balance we're going to have in chapter 1. It'll be interesting to see that even after this most philosophical chapter in chapter 1, I think this philosophical battle undergirding and even balance of his words is going to go all the way through, and we're going to find some of these things hidden in there that we hadn't seen before. I have talked before about, and I know there's 100 plus examples I could give if I could give them. But since I can't, the one I'll bring up again is Dante's trilogy, the Inferno, Paradise, and Purgatory in Latin. He wrote the three. I might argue that it was the most amazing work of art ever written, in that it had such rhythm, rhyme, all the way through it, 33 lines plus one, followed by 33 lines plus one, and 33 lines plus one. And each of those 33 lines was, 33 verses. Each of those 33 verses was 3 lines. Each of those lines was 11 syllables. Therefore, you've got 33 syllables in 33 verses. And all of the rhyme was through there. Just through this vast work, he had it just so poetically perfect or linguistically perfect. Here, what we're going to see, I think, is the word John, and we're going to find all the way through that he's got this balance thing that is going on, that he's a little bit talking about, if I can use the phrase out of its context of the musical anyway, he's talking about the fiddler, how to fiddle on a roof is what he's saying. Philosophically, how do you balance all these things in life? And he's going to come to some conclusions on that. We hope I'll probably be 3 or 4 weeks in the Gospel of John. With that, let me lead us in a word of prayer, and we'll join back next Wednesday. Heavenly Father, thank you for the philosophical beginning of this. Some heady stuff we have to chew on through chapter 1 especially. But even as we get into the words of Jesus later on, to put all this together, help us to understand the flow of thought that John has and the beauty of these words, and that the beauty of these words might rest themselves deep in our soul. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.